Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Burlett, and I will be discussing Chapter 7, which discusses theories of human development. There were about 4 major topics explored throughout Chapter 7. The first being we're answering the question, what do we mean when we discuss human development? And then 3 major cognitive developmental theories are discussed, one by Piaget, one by Vygotsky, and one by Erikson. So the very beginning of Chapter 7 begins by answering this question, what is human development? And so as we mature from babies to adults, we obviously undergo changes. The first one being the most obvious, which is physiology. Our bodies grow, our bodies change, things are lost. So babies are born with more bones, so we lose some bones. We grow up. That's the obvious sign of maturing. And then the second part of human development is how we develop psychologically. So, how are we increasing intellectual capability? How are we gaining more insight into behavioral capabilities? And then we come to cognition, which is the star of the show. So, cognition is all about the way that we learn, the way that we think and process information, which is integral to learning. So the 3 major theories that we will discuss in this chapter all have to do with cognition and the theories put forth about how we develop cognitively, because this is when things start to get a bit more complex and hard to categorize. And then the other 2 fields are social and cultural development, how we interact with the world, how we are born into an environment with specific rules and customs that govern how we interact with the world, how we view the world. And so how does this kind of fit into our development? So the first theory that the chapter discusses is that of Piaget. So Jean Piaget was a Swiss epistemologist, and he studied cognitive structures specifically in children. And so he believes, or the notion that this theory is founded on, is that as a person matures, they progress through different stages of cognition. The first being sensory motor. So this happens when we are from birth to 2. We're developing motor skills. So we are primarily concerned with how to pick our head up, how to roll over, how to grasp a glass of water. Maybe not glass, more like plastic at this point. And the second stage would be the pre-operational stage. So this occurs when we were from about 2 to 7. And so during the pre-operational stage, objects are typically identified and associated through language. So language is really going to be integral to our development during this stage. And then we have the concrete operational stage. So this is from 7 to 11. So concrete operational is defined by our ability to think logically. So one of the most famous distinctions between pre-operational and concrete is that a kid in the pre-operational stage will look at 2 different sized glasses of water that contain the same amount of water, but they might say that a taller glass would have more water in it because it's taller. They think because it's taller, it's bigger in volume. And then a child in the concrete operational stage would understand that it is the same amount of water, they're just in different glasses. And so the final cognitive stage, according to Piaget, is the formal operational, which means that we are able to think in hypotheticals, we are able to think abstractly. So we start to think of, like in this graphic, the glasses being half full or half empty, rather than simply looking at it to determine how much water is in it. So a few concepts that are integral to this theory are assimilation versus accommodation. Assimilation means that we are creating internal representations and associating new information with pre-existing representation. And then we have accommodation, which are our internal structures. And these internal structures, when they encounter new information, they are changed or they're created in order to account for these new experiences, which leads to this concept of cognitive dissonance. So, according to Piaget and according to scholars who take up Piaget's mantle, cognitive dissonance is not pleasant. And so people who experience cognitive dissonance don't typically seek out these experiences that make us question our entire pre-existing representation, our prior knowledge. So what we would do is either reject this new information or find a way to make it fit in with our pre-existing notions. Or we would experience a complete paradigm shift, which is when assimilation would fail. And then we go into this concept of mental models and schema. So mental models are going to be this information that allows us to almost create a scaffold for new information. And then schema allows this information to be assigned or more applied automatically. So for example, a mental model of a house, we would go into someone's house, we wouldn't necessarily know where things are, but because we have the schema of what a house is, what it entails, like what is in most homes, then we are able to navigate it with enough knowledge of where we're going. And the second theory that we discuss is the social mediated theory by a Russian theorist named Vygotsky. So this notion is based on that development is determined primarily through social and cultural context. So according to Vygotsky, there is a person in all of our lives who is an MKO, or a more knowledgeable person, and we look to them to fill in the gaps to learn from. So they play a critical role in individual development by presenting ideas in a social context. So we would learn from our mothers, we would learn from our fathers, we would learn from older siblings or other people our age. And then the ZPD, the zone of proximal development, measures the distance between our ability to understand a concept independently, which would indicate that we have internalized relevant concepts and individually have undergone cognitive development. It's the distance between being able to do things independently and what we can do with the help of an MKO. So typically the zone of proximal development would be used in a classroom by placing a student who did not do so well on a test with a student who did do well on a test. So the ZPD would theorize that the student, this MKO, would help to fill in the gaps for this other student. And then the last theory that is discussed in the chapter is Erikson's psychosocial development theory. So the special thing about Erikson is that he extends his theory to encompass our whole life and not just our childhood. So we go from infancy, babies, all the way to maturity, which is when we would become elderly and die. So Erikson's notion relies on the way a person would respond to each stage of development. And each stage, this response to each stage of development would determine identity and the way that we would construct our thoughts about ourselves. He was very heavily influenced by Freud. And so there are 8 stages. But adult learning theory borrows very heavily from Erikson because he is one of the very famous theorists that have actually extended cognitive development into our adult lives. So I hope this has been enlightening. I hope this has helped you to get a sense of what you're about to read in the chapter. Yeah, thank you so much for listening.